We're going to tie these 7 things together in just a few minutes, but number 1 is malingering, and what we're talking about are 7 things, or maybe I should phrase it this way: 7 ways that people with autism are misunderstood. That is to say that people take these traits and they consign them to us, and they shouldn't. They're not true. Well, usually they're not true. I guess we could be guilty of any or all of these things, but they're frequently incorrectly assigned to us. And number 1 is malingering. And what is malingering? Well, that is where we exaggerate or maybe even feign or fake an illness so that we can get out of some kind of a duty or work. Now, are people with autism guilty of that? Well, I have been over the past, particularly when I was a kid. If I didn't want to do something, I would feign illness. I'd pretend that I was sick, and I had parents that didn't fall for that. I can't remember ever getting out of going to school because I pretended I was sick. Somehow they could tell. I don't know how they did it, but they could tell that this kid is faking it. Well, maybe I understand, because, when my kids were sick, I could tell. So it's part of parenting, part of nature. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about people with autism who are perceived as faking autism so that they can get out of work or maybe get social benefits or maybe acquire sympathy or empathy from other people because, well, I'm autistic. What do you expect? And do people with autism sometimes do that? It's hard for me to imagine not doing that on occasion. But when people consign that trait to us too often, that's simply being misunderstood. And people love to pretend to misunderstand people because I don't know why they do it, but I think all of us do it. We'll misunderstand that person even though we don't misunderstand that person. We'll pretend, we'll malinger that we misunderstand a person when we really don't. It's our way of, I think, maybe gaining control. And I'm going to put this cord behind my back. Hopefully it won't make quite as much noise. Number 2 is laziness. I don't know how many times I've been accused of being lazy when I wasn't lazy. It was difficult to get engaged, but laziness is the quality of being unwilling to work or use energy. That's the definition I found. And I don't understand why they call it a quality, but maybe they should call it the ability or the attempted ability to be unwilling to work or to use energy. That's not necessarily the same as malingering, because in malingering, you're making an excuse. In laziness, I think malingering is a form of laziness, maybe. The laziness is you just don't want to do it. I don't know how many times in my life there were things that I could do differently, and I was willing to spend the time and effort to do them. And there are other ways it was difficult to do it, so I chose to do it the way that was most effective. And people would misinterpret that as laziness. And the classic example that I've given in the past is when I was a kid, my parents noticed that I like to play the piano, played by ear, as they call it. So they gave me piano lessons, and I just, didn't want to try to figure out all those silly notes, as I call them bugs, on a sheet of paper. To me, that was very difficult, challenging, beyond the pale, but I would spend a lot of time playing the piano. I wasn't lazy. I would study on my own. I would learn how to play chords and put things together. So I put the time and effort into it. I just didn't want to do it that way. That wasn't laziness. What do you call that? I don't know. Maybe there's a term for it. Number 3 is indifference. That is to say, a lack of interest, concern, or sympathy. A lot of times we're falsely understood as we just don't care. We're just indifferent about things. Indifference, yeah, again, we're guilty of all of these things because we're human on occasion, but a lot of times people in the hive mind understand that, or misunderstand, that we don't necessarily behave the way they do. They expect us to, but we don't. And they have these traits that signal indifference. And we have similar traits which do not signal indifference, but they think they do signal indifference because The behavioral traits are the same as indifference. It's not that we lack interest in going to a concert, say for example, or going to some other social event. It's not that we're indifferent. It's that we don't want to put up with the social pressure. We don't want to put up with the peer pressure. We don't want to put up maybe with the noise. Maybe we find it very difficult to be anything other than a wallflower. Because we've been there before, like every day of our lives, where we are forced and compelled to be in social settings and we find it very discomforting. And it's not that we're indifferent, that we don't care, but we just don't know how to do it. And they don't understand that. When I was a kid, I didn't understand it about myself. I say when I was a kid, throughout most of my life, even as an adult, I really didn't understand why other people were so socially active and socially adept, where I was socially inept. Just couldn't get the hang of it. But I wasn't indifferent. It wasn't that I didn't care. It was more that I didn't know. I didn't know you're not supposed to do that. Okay, number 4 is sometimes we are misunderstood as lacking motivation. So I say unmotivated. That is defined as not having interest or enthusiasm in something or for something, especially, for example, work or study. That's kind of like laziness, isn't it? Well, laziness is an unwillingness where unmotivated, you're willing to be willing, but, it's like somebody said one time, it doesn't bother me that I don't care, but it bothers me that I don't care that I don't care. Just no motive whatsoever. There's some things in my life I find it difficult to get motivated to do, but once I get started, I'm fine. I'm motivated to do it, and I'm unmotivated to stop doing it. One thing, for example, is I love to walk. I love to go out and jog, but sometimes, particularly when it's cold outside or hot outside, the weather's not being cooperative, or I'm just tired, I find that I am being unmotivated to get out there and hit the road, so to speak. Put on my sneakers, or trainers as they call them in the UK. And so I'm unmotivated. But once I get out there, I think, running down the road, I'm thinking, man, this is great. Why was I so unmotivated? So yeah, sometimes I get unmotivated, but sometimes I'm misunderstood for being unmotivated. And again, this is a lot like indifference and laziness, but the motive would be there if I could just get part of what's going on. And I found this to be a lot in high school. I love speech class. That seems to be a little bit ironic, but I love to be engaged in public speaking. But I found that sometimes my instructors and teachers, they would get frustrated with me. What's wrong with this guy? He doesn't seem to be motivated. Yeah, I wanted to do it, but I just came across with that flat effect, that poker face. And they misinterpreted that. This guy's not interested. He has no motive whatsoever. That seemed to be their response. Number 5. And you've probably experienced this. That's being stupid. Just flat out stupidity. I can understand that because a lot of people with autism find it challenging to do schoolwork. They go to school, they have this pressure. As I like to say, it's akin to being thrown into a river or a lake when you can't swim and you're forced to flounder around all day. I mean, how in the world can you focus on studies? Well, it turns out that there are a lot of people with autism who are extraordinarily gifted academically, and it shows. In fact, I would say that autism is probably highly represented among highly intelligent academic people. But there are some of us that, it's just not there. Now, I asked a psychologist one time, why is it that I did so poorly in school, but they kept passing me? And he explained, and I don't know why I didn't think of this, I probably should have, but he explained that, at the end of the year, they give you a test. And so even though you weren't engaged in your schoolwork and you kind of daydreamed in school, you were still learning, you were still getting it, and the instructors noticed. So they passed you on to the next grade, even though you didn't seem to be highly intelligent at the time. It was apparent at the end of the year, you were grasping it. So they understood at first they misunderstood this guy's just not too bright, or they would say this guy's unmotivated or indifferent or lazy, or any one of those things we already talked about. But then, when they gave the test at the end of the year, they'd figure out none of that's true. So some people do figure this out. And of course, there are people with autism who are not really intelligent. So maybe it's not a misunderstanding, but often it is. Number 6 is we are sometimes misunderstood and accused of lacking empathy. And I think the reason is because there's more than one type of empathy. So if you are lacking empathy, that is the ability to understand and identify the mental states of others, people say you lack empathy. But what about the ability to understand and feel the feelings of others? That's also empathy. So the first is cognitive empathy. The second is affective empathy. I seem to be very strong in affective empathy, but the problem is because I have that flat effect, can't always tell it. So people misunderstand me as being indifferent and lacking empathy. But I'm really touched by the hurtings of other people, particularly those who are lonely. I don't know if you have those feelings or not. If you do, let me know in the comment section. Number 7 is being impolite. I mean, intentionally impolite. I got to tell you, I have been impolite a lot of times over my life, and I didn't do it intentionally. It just, it was. People with autism will sometimes, because we're socially inept, we will say things or do things that are not socially acceptable, and those are considered impolite. It's not intentional. And there's a huge difference between being intentionally impolite, like snubbing people on purpose, and just not having the social skills to engage people. Now, one of the advantages that I had growing up is that I had a brother who was 5 years older than me, who was not autistic. He's very outgoing. And I would observe him, and I would learn from him. And if he didn't sit me down and teach me things, but I just learned from watching him. For example, when I was like 11 or 12, he had a girlfriend. He's 5 years older, so as a teenager, he had a girlfriend, and maybe she would go with a family someplace. So, Dad would drive the car, or maybe my brother would drive, and he'd get out and he'd walk up to the door, knock on the door, and walk her to the car, open the door for her, all those courtesies. No one taught me those things. And if it hadn't been for observing my brother, I never would have learned, I had a girlfriend who would pull up in front of her house and hit the horn. Waited for her to come out, open the door herself, and get in. That wasn't being intentionally impolite. Fortunately, I didn't do that because I learned from observation, but it would have been impolite nonetheless. So the problem is sometimes we are intentionally, or unintentionally, I should say, misunderstood as being intentionally impolite, when we actually are, according to the accepted behavior of what is politeness in the hive mind, the neurotypical hive mind, we are considered to be impolite, and on their standards, I guess we are. But it's not intentional. We do have good manners if we know what they are. When we're around the hive mind, we have those sensibilities to others, and sometimes we don't, but it's seldom intentional. And again, we can be intentionally impolite. We're not immune from those things. So, all right, let's tie all this together, make sense of all of it all in one. There's this thing called unconscious bias, and people in the hive mind who live in the neurotypical hive mind, they don't know it. They have unconscious bias. That's why we call it unconscious. They're not aware of the fact that they are being biased against us. So we could say, they're just malingering. They're just faking, to have this unconscious bias. No, they're not. So we can make all these same accusations against them. They're just lazy. They won't try to understand us, so they're just indifferent. They don't care about us. They're just unmotivated. We could go along and say all these same things about them. But they have unconscious bias, and that refers to prejudices and attitudes. that exist within an individual that are subconscious, and their actions may be influenced and their decisions may be influenced, and they are not even aware that they have these biases. In other words, they think it is reality. And I guarantee you, if you're autistic, you have experienced unconscious bias throughout your life. That is one of the reasons that people with autism find it so hard to perform well in school and virtually impossible to hold down a job. Because people don't understand us, neurotypical people in the hive mind don't understand us because they have a bias and they're not even aware of it. Now, some of them wouldn't care if they were aware of it. And if you try to make people aware of it, a lot of times they take offense. I was trying to say affront and offense at the same time, but offense. But they take offense because we're trying to point out that they have a bias and they're not aware of it, and they will argue in their defense. No, this is not an unconscious bias. This is a real, you actually are lazy, or you really are unmotivated, or you really do lack empathy. That was a real challenge for me when I was a pastor for 12 years. Probably not the best profession for somebody who is autistic, and people took notice, where's your empathy? I had empathy, I just didn't show it, and they were happy and eager to, criticize me for it. So we find that this unconscious bias can affect various aspects of life, like hiring decisions. They look at these 7 things we talked about, and this guy can't work here. He's not courteous, or he's not real bright, or he seems to be indifferent. Our interactions with others, they don't understand why we are different from everyone in the hive mind. And they don't know that they're biased. They just are biased. Or they may know they're biased, but they think it's a legitimate bias. Their perceptions of different groups of people. We're a group of people, one of probably an infinite number. You can categorize people all kinds of ways. And it should be noticed that unconscious bias isn't something that is unique to people who live in the hive mind, the neurotypical hive mind. People with autism can have unconscious bias as well against people in the hive mind, or against an unconscious bias that affects our perception of anyone, including, each other. If you got something out of this video, we invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Give this video a thumbs up if you got something out of it and you think it deserves it. Leave a comment or question. Let us know where you're coming from. Maybe join a conversation. Sharing this on social media like Twitter, formerly Twitter, now X, or Facebook, or whatever social media that you're engaged in really helps. If you think it helps you, it would help somebody else, so that's a good reason to share it, and we'll see you all next time.